Previously on agentpalmer.com, I finally have perspective on the Meadow 20 years after it was required reading. I'm attempting to once again be a well-rounded amateur musician, and it's possible Bubba Wheat has me watching trailers again. This is the Palmer Files, episode 55, featuring Kjell Vandevyvere, the creator behind Coffee and Pens and a prolific creator across blog, newsletter, and now podcast. Kjell and I discuss reading and writing, process and organization, where writing actually happens, and so much more. Are you ready? Let's do the show. Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 55th episode is Kjell Vandevyvere, the guiding force behind Coffee and Pens and a future author you should keep an eye on, but more on that during the episode. Kjell and I are both curious creators. We want to know how things work and about processes, and that's what led him to Coffee and Pens, which in turn is what led me to him. We talk about localized colloquialisms, top 3 guide, the classics, taking notes, numbers, reading, inspiration, languages, plus I get on a soapbox and, there's other things that happen as well. Now, before we get going, remember that if you want to discuss this episode as you listen or after, you can tweet me at Agent Palmer, my guest Kjell at Kjell VDV, that's KJELLVDV, and this show at the Palmer Files. For all things Kjell, you can visit coffeeandpens.com or kjellv.com. That's just KJELLV.com. And on those sites, you can find links to his podcast, newsletter, or contact him further. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. So without further ado, grab a cup of coffee, however you take it, and away we go. Kjell, I'm going to start with what is Coffee and Pens?
Okay, straight to the action. Coffee and Pens is a project that I started 5 months ago. I had this idea, how do people write a book? And who can I talk to figure out how it's done? So I had been on Twitter for a few months at that moment, and I knew a couple of people that had written or self-published their first book. So I reached out to them because in some way or other I was connected with them. I reached out to them and asked them, hey, can I interview you about how you wrote your book and see what I can learn? Surprisingly, I reached out to 4 or 5 people. They all accepted. So that's how I got started. And then I started looking for more people who had written, self-published, mainly self-published, not everyone, their first book or a couple of books. And I talked to them about how did you get the idea? How did you market your book? Which tools did you use? Did you work with someone? Why did you self-publish? And about specific topics of their books that in some way or other may apply to the writing process and to the publishing process.
So you started that, did you want to write a book? Like, is it like, I want to write a book and I want to know more about it?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So why am I saying this? It's always been kind of like a childhood dream to write a book one day. So I would picture myself as a writer, as an author sometime in the future. But I'm also saying no because it was not with the intention of learning about the entire writing process that I started it. It was out of curiosity and not with the idea of I'm going to just write a book right now after having learned everything. But now that I'm 20 something episodes in it and I feel like I've learned so much about the entire publishing thing, I feel more ready than ever to write a book, and I'm more motivated to start right now, but I haven't still figured out what exactly I want to write about.
So are you so I'm very much, I've said this before and I will probably always say this when it comes to writing, I am a strike while the iron is hot kind of a guy. If I can write 5 posts for my blog in a weekend, I will do it. Like I will, that's fine. I don't mind that. And I always like to be ahead and have like posts drafted well in advance in order to kind of mitigate the effect of writer's block. Like I try not, it's the blog is a passion project. I try not to force it like, oh shit, I have to write today. Like, I don't want that to be the case. Like, oh no, I wrote this. This is great. And I like the idea of editing. I have no problem with that. And I have friends that will take a look as another set of eyes, but I'm always waiting for that inspiration. Like I write about anything and everything. There are movies that I adore that I just don't have that spark of that inspiration to write about. Like I have a list of movies I want to write about, but until I get that idea, like, oh, I want to tell people that this is a great movie because X, Y, and Z. But if I don't have that, or if I don't have that one, sometimes it's just a sentence, right? Like, oh, that's an amazing introduction. Okay, I'll just write that down and I'm off to the races. But if I don't have any of that stuff, I don't force it. And the closest I come to forcing it is when I draft up the intros and the outros for this podcast. Because when I do that's, I don't have a choice, right? Like, yeah, I can record with you weeks, months in advance, right? But at a certain point, like I have to, like this is going to go out and I have to have written whatever intro they've already heard because but I don't know what that's going to be. And there are times when I get close and I release this podcast every 2 weeks. So I have a buffer, but sometimes it's Thursday. The podcast releases on Tuesday. You have to actually record what you're going to write. Maybe you should write it. Like, and for me, the introduction is kind of formulaic and it's the outro. Like, what did I learn from this conversation? And sometimes I'm like, I don't know. And it hasn't happened in a while, right? And that's where my process becomes like, that's where I will dive into like your site for like tips and tricks to get going. But at a certain point, I will avoid sites like yours and writing tips because if it's working, I don't want to mess with it. Like I don't want anything from anyone else. Like, oh, that's good. Like I sat down to write something and it just flowed out of me. Perfect. I don't want to ever mess that up. Like never. That is not something. So when you talk about like, I want to write, but I'm not ready to start, I completely understand because to me, and I used to write for a living for like websites and stuff, and that's a different mindset. But when you're talking about telling a story, and you don't have to stuff it with keywords, and you don't have to write to, a meta tag and this, that, and when you don't have to write for the internet, you can allow yourself to be inspired and you can wait for it and kind of curate that like, oh, it's time. I've got a story I have to tell and I want to share it with people. So yeah. I know where you're at. Do you get anxious though? Because like, so I have the blog, I have an outlet and I know you've written for your site, but like, are you anxious to get started? Like, oh, I've learned all these things but I'm just waiting for that one idea. You're waiting for that one light bulb.
Yeah, I think I do get anxious, and like I've learned all these things, and now I want to apply them. Like I need to apply them, but there's a big like difference in what you just talked about between writing blog posts and writing a book. Because when you're writing a book, it's like, okay, you've got this one idea, and you're going to spend the next couple of months, maybe a year with it. When it's a blog post, you're going to spend the next couple of hours with it at most.
That's
so
fair.
I don't have any problem at all, like writing blog posts. Like you, I'm just thinking about things the entire day, and then I've got this line or this idea, and like, hey, this is something interesting. This is something I need to explore a little bit more. And I start thinking about it. I shared a thread about it or a tweet about it recently. Like writing, it happens in your head. It doesn't happen on pen and paper or on your computer. So like I'm thinking about stuff for a few minutes, maybe a few hours. Like, okay, I'm going to give this argument and this and that, and I start writing, and I can write like a short blog post in 15 minutes because I've like thought about it, everything, and inspiration is there. But that doesn't work with a book. Like with a book, it's not think about something for a few hours and you've got the entire idea together.
No, that's true. I will say, like, I've gotten that question. And to me, and I think to the average blogger, period, this question I'm about to talk about seems ridiculous. But to somebody who doesn't blog, it's a legit question, I guess, because the people that don't understand what blogging is always ask. I get the question a lot, or at least I used to. So when are you going to write a book? And to me, it's like, well, I get to write a little bit about a lot of different things. And yeah, I got some series, like I write about music, or I write about like a certain, an author or whatever. To me, that's such a jump, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and I understand it's, at the most, some of my most well-researched posts have been like a week, right? It's just a week. Okay. Or maybe two. Mm-hmm. And then I get to put it out. And I think that one of the things is I enjoy that process. Like, look, I put out one post a week. And at a certain point, I was putting out 2 a week, and it was getting crazy. And I settled back, which is why I have, like, drafts just everywhere. But, if I want to, I can just drop all my posts. They can go live. A book... One of the things that intrigues me about a book, though I don't have the interest right now, is you don't get to hit publish. I mean, you do, but you don't. Like, you've got to put in that time and effort and energy, and then edit and edit and edit. And I'm not unfamiliar. I had a friend who wrote a novel that I edited that we haven't really revisited since. Mm-hmm. But I saw him, and it was a novel, right? It's fiction. But I saw I don't know what the tribulations, of a writer who's like, he's trying not to write himself into a corner and this, that, and the other thing. And I understand nonfiction's different, which is what most of my longer form posts are. But having said all that, as the guy who's just a blogger that gets, well, when are you going to write a book? I go, I don't have an interest. Maybe one day. I don't have an interest. So like, I kind of applaud you for acknowledging it. Like I want to write a book. Like that you put that on your to-do list and you want to check it off. Like that's pretty big. And I mean, the more you talk to these people, the more you do the research and like kind of fill out coffee and pens, like you start to realize exactly what you're getting into. And I wonder, like, are you also a little more scared the more you learn?
Great question. Actually, I don't think so. In contrary, I feel more confident because the more I learn, like, the more ideas I get about how to do things right.
Okay.
Like, these people have launched successful books, and they've told me how they marketed it, how they applied to like writing in public, which tools they used. And on top of what I learned from them, I've kind of built a connection with them. So if I ever get into a problem while writing a book, I know I could probably reach out to maybe not all of them, but like 90% of them and pose my question and get their help. So I think I feel more confident rather than more scared.
I like it. I like it. That's good. What about writing in general, though? Like, have you always wanted to be a writer? Like, or have you always been a writer, I should say? Like I feel like I keep bringing this point up in my podcasts a lot. Like, everybody has to write in school. Like, you can't avoid it. Yeah. You have to write something. Uh-huh. But then there's some of us that are like, well, this isn't that bad. Like, I like this. Were you one of those? Like, it's time to write. Like, you may not like what you're writing about in school, but you enjoy the process of writing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was me. So in school, I never had any problems with writing, not much. English is not my first language, and I enjoyed English classes. Something else then in university, I studied languages, so there was a lot of writing there as well, like different kinds of writing, like press releases, translations, and I mostly enjoyed them. But I didn't do any writing for myself until I was about 22 or 23, and I did a gap year. And then I decided to start a blog because, I didn't want to have the same conversation over and over again. Didn't want to talk to friend A and say, hey, this is what I've been up to this week. Hey, then to my uncle, this is what I've been up to this week. And actually, that was kind of very like self-centered, like thinking the whole world revolves around me because no one ever read it because they weren't interested in what I was doing. So I wouldn't even have to have had these conversations over and over again, but it was what got me started.
Do you go back and look at because obviously that's kind of where this journey that you're on right now started.
Yeah.
Do you go back and look at them and go like, wow, I've come a long way.
So a little bit. I don't intentionally go back and compare what I've written and see how much I've improved, but I can think of 2 examples. And maybe there were only 2 situations where I did this. But a few weeks ago, maybe a month or 2, I wanted to share a little bit more about myself with the people that follow me on Twitter. So I wrote a thread, a little bit of a personal journey from when I started the gap year until where I am now. And to do that, I did have a look at those first blog posts that I posted, and I skimmed through them really. I didn't read them, but that was when I had to look back, on when I started, why I wrote about certain things. And then a second example is the first real blogging project that I started. Now, the second, last year in June, I talked to a friend and said, hey, we should kind of build something together, a kind of website where we do research blog posts about productivity. So we created this website called Top 3 Guide. And like you said a while ago, sometimes you'd research for 1 or 2 weeks to do something.
Yeah.
And we did that. We researched 1 or 2 weeks about, okay, how do you build a habit step by step? And then we'd write in 3 steps, this is how you build a habit. Or these are the top 3 ideas to be more productive today. So that was my first experience with regular posting things once a week. That's what we tried. We ended up writing about 30 topics in maybe 5 or 6 months. And then it wasn't going where we wanted it to go, and we quit. But it's still up. It still exists because it's getting some search engine traffic, and we may want to retake it someday. Who knows? So I looked back at one of those early posts now, maybe last month or the month before, and I edited it. And then I did see a kind of gap. Okay, this is how I wrote 1 year ago, and this is how I write now. And my writing was full of fluff, full of words. Not fluff in terms of this doesn't add value, but full of words that don't belong in a clear text.
Sure.
So
I think you may be one of the few writers I've talked to where English isn't your first language. So does that make it harder or help, actually? I mean, or is it both?
Yeah, I think it's both. So it helps, I think, with grammar, because I've been to high school, I had 5 years of English. University, I had 4 years of English, quite intense. So there is probably not a single rule of grammar that I have never seen about the English language. And I know many native speakers, they've never learned the grammar.
Yeah.
They have no idea. They know things are the way they are, but they don't know why. And I'm not sure why this is, but I've always had a quite good feeling for English grammar. I've never had to study it much. I always kind of hear when something sounds wrong or when something sounds right. So that's been a benefit. But I've had many native speakers tell me that I speak better than them, more correctly than they do.
Yeah.
But then the negative thing is I'll never learn all the colloquialisms and all the like cultural references and the metaphor, well, not metaphors, but the, you know,
The cliches.
the kind of the cliches and everything, right? Like I'll remember like what's it called, fit as a fiddle or something like that. But then there are like way more things that people get naturally, and that I won't. Like, I'll understand them, but I won't be able to reproduce
Yeah,
them.
well, but that's cultural anyway, right? Like that's going to
Yeah.
be the same, because obviously that's different in England versus America, right? Like the colloquialisms are just localized. So I don't know if you'd get that anyway, but unless you're setting a novel somewhere, that's not that
Hmm.
it's not that big of a deal, really.
Okay.
At least to me, right? Like, and I'm not going to say I'm an Anglophile, okay? But I have read a lot of, like British spy novels. And
Okay.
while they are mostly set in the Cold War, 60s and 70s kind of a deal, maybe there's some things that go over my head, but I still enjoy the story, right? Like I'm not like, oh, for the one example I can think of is like a university tie or a college tie that always seems to come up in certain types of British fiction. And that's not something we really, maybe it's something here, but it's out of my circle. Like I have no clue
Uh-huh.
what any of that really means. Like, oh, well, he was wearing an Oxford tie. Like, I don't, okay. Like, so you don't like that or you do, right? And you just figure it out
Uh-huh.
based on what's going on. So I don't think that's as big of a deal. I mean, let me ask you this. When you talk about wanting to write a book,
Yeah.
as not an American. So in America, it's always, so you're going to write the great American novel, and that's always the benchmark.
Yeah.
Especially for fiction. And unfortunately for us, especially people who are writers of any kind, the great American novel is held up to a standard that existed in the 60s. And occasionally, and arguably, there's a novel here or there that changes the shift in paradigm or whatever. Does that exist outside of America? Like, our colloquialism is the great American novel. Like, you're going to change literature in America. Like that's what we say to young writers. Does that exist outside? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if you're hearing this for the first time or the 50th, but like, what is that? That can't have any cultural relevance to you.
Yeah, I don't think so. It's something I've never thought about. I've heard of like the great American novel. I've never even thought about researching it if it's something I want to do.
It's such a weird thing. It's like the only thing I can think of on a world stage is like, oh, that's cool. Your 10-year-old is playing football. You're going to win the World Cup next year? Like, what? Like, I don't, we have this standard for writers. It's like, yeah, all right, well, you're going to be famous after this comes out, right? Like, that's the standard. And I think you just want to tell your story, right? Like, that's it.
Yeah.
Do you drink coffee? Like, is that where coffee and pens comes from? Like, is coffee your go-to time to write drink?
It's not related to writing much. I drink 2 or 3 cups a day. Get up, fix my first cup. Probably have one before, again, another one before noon, somewhere between 10 and 12, and then another one in the afternoon. Is that where coffee and pens comes from? Maybe yes and maybe no. I can't remember very well. It's something, when I started these interviews, I asked Twitter for feedback. Like I wrote, hey, I want to do this interview, thinking about a name. And there were a few suggestions, some related to coffee, some related to pens or something. And maybe someone came up with coffee and pens. Maybe it was something I put together. And I just thought, yeah, you know, I like coffee. Coffee is kind of associated with writing, with the artistic. And pens, you know, you need pens. So I thought that was a good name. I'm not sure if I'd pick the same name again. but I think it's not a bad name.
Do you still write? Do you still handwrite?
No, almost never. Like I've got a piece of paper here, which is a little bit, but those are notes for my paid for some paid work. So I've got another piece of paper here. Those are also notes. So that's not really writing, is it?
Well, I think it is. I mean, you know, one of the things I keep hearing about is that there is a greater correlation for memory when you physically write something versus typing it.
Yeah.
But like you're talking to the world's worst note taker, right? Like I've lost more good ideas because I didn't write them down in time or whatever than I will ever have published. Like period. And I need to get, that's the one habit I need to get into is writing this stuff down more.
Yeah.
And I just don't like even I'm so bad with it that I can tell you half of the podcasts I've done. I record and then I edit and then I put it on a shelf and then I listen back and I take notes. And I can't tell you how many times I had an idea during the edit that I didn't write down. And then I go and listen to take my notes and I cannot, for the life of me, come back to whatever that idea was. It's gone. And while it's happened on probably half of the episodes of this show, I still am not good enough to just write it down.
Yeah. Yeah, it's this thing of not wanting to do, I think, two things at the same time.
Yeah.
So when I edit my podcasts, I also have ideas sometimes, but I know I'm in the editing stage. You know, I'm listening. Where is there a gap? When is someone coughing? Yeah. I'm trying to get those out. And then I know that I'm going to listen again after having gone through this editing process. I'm going to listen again to take the notes. And maybe sometimes something escapes, but it's it's a compromise that you need to make with yourself, because if you're going to try to do two things at the same time and taking notes and editing, you're not going to do any of those too well.
Yeah. I also wonder too, like maybe it wasn't meant to be. Like I'm still getting these shows out. Like people are still listening to them.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a pressure of deadline, I feel like, that we all put on ourselves. And I try and work ahead so I don't really have to work to the deadline. But you can't help it sometimes. Some life happens, obviously, which is completely unrelated. It is related, but it is also unrelated to the creative process. But sometimes you're just like, well, that flowed out and it's perfect. And sometimes you're like, ooh, what do I do? What do I do now? Like, and it's one of the reasons that I like doing this stuff, because I get to tell a story. We get to share your story with my audience. And there's something kind of, I don't know, campfire-ish, right? Like we're back to just talking.
Yeah.
I don't think people talk enough. One of the things that I almost called this show The Conversationalist, but I didn't want. But look, I went with the Palmer Files because it's, you know, branding, but like I didn't want it to be too generic. But maybe, you know, that's what it is. Like I don't feel like people talk anymore. Like I say something to you, and then you say something to me, and if we're having a real conversation, you're listening and then bouncing back versus, while you're talking, I'm just thinking about what I'm going to say next, which I try not to do. I'm sure I'm guilty of it, but I try not to do that. And I feel like that's it. It's one of the reasons I like writing, because like I'm sharing this with you and hopefully you're going to see it, or I'm telling you this story and hopefully you're going to hear it. And too many people are caught up in their own place. Like, no, just sit back and listen.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Like, I don't know, when you're like, what do you feel when you hit publish on either a blog post or a podcast episode? Like, you know, are you on to the next thing? Are you excited for what you've just done?
between looking at the stats and moving on to the next thing. So they both happen. Like I'm a bit too obsessed with the metrics sometimes, especially when they're not good enough. Like when I see I hit publish on something, and then the first day it's getting like 50 views. Yeah, good. That did well. But then I hit publish on something like the newest interview I released yesterday, and I released a little bit early so that it would match with the launch day of that new book.
Yeah.
I thought, matching events is going to be perfect. You know what? It has had 2 views up till now, almost 24 hours. I'm like, what happened? And that upsets me a little bit. But it doesn't like stop me from moving on. Like I'll be upset about the metrics, but it doesn't stop me from starting on the next one.
Yeah, it's weird about metrics. The blog is turning 10 this year.
Uh-huh.
I don't even really look. I couldn't even tell you where I'm at with metrics anymore. And look, I'm not getting hundreds of thousands of views. So I don't want anybody to think like, oh, well, that's my cash cow, because it's not. Mm-hmm. But I do know it's much better than when I was agonizing over the statistics when it was like, when you celebrate 1 view, right? Because when you start out and you're like, oh, I got 10 posts and 6 people, like, it's like, oh, whatever. And then for me, it was always just, are people consuming it on a slightly regular basis? And so it was like, all right, well, I got 1 person to visit my site each day in this month. That was huge. Like 34 visits in a month. Like, this is great. But at a certain point, you just stop. The podcast turns 2, and I see the numbers on my dashboard because when I log into my host, they're there.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I almost wish they weren't there, because I wouldn't. I just feel like I don't want to know. Like, if I want to know, I'll look for it. Like, I'll actively look for it.
Yeah.
But I also think it comes with time. The blog is 10, and I'm sure I looked at numbers for the first 4 or 5 years. Like, and I won't say I live and die with them, but I'm with you. When you look at the numbers and they're not what you want, you get disappointed.
Yeah.
And I shifted towards this most recent 5 years of the blog to being satisfied with hitting publish, because I know there's some people that'll read it and there's some people that won't. And I tried to focus on being satisfied that I did the best I could to share something, and that hopefully a lot of people will see it. But I've taken those people out of the equation as much as possible, because it's hard. It's a crowded market. All of it is. Like, no matter what you're doing, what you're writing, what you're producing, what you're putting out there, there's a million other people putting other things out there. And I tried to make that shift, and it took years, obviously, to get there.
Yeah.
But you want to get to that point where, like, publish is the satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
The people, like the hundreds of thousands of people that could potentially listen or read something, that's the icing.
Yeah. A lot depends, for me, on why I'm writing. So I've got 2 things going on, let's say. That's Coffee and Pens, and it's a daily newsletter that I started writing this month, kind of like to just force myself to write every day about something and explore new ideas. So Coffee and Pens, I'm writing that for other people. Like, I'm writing, this is what I learned, this is what you can learn about how to write a book. So I'm writing this for you. And then if that person isn't reading it, well, then it hurts a little bit, because I'm writing it for someone else, and that someone else isn't there.
Okay, yeah.
And then the daily newsletter is like you say with your podcast, you sign into your newsletter like tool. And the first thing that you see is the number of subscribers, so I know.
Yeah.
And while it's staying stable, I'm happy. And a little thing inside me says, why is this not growing? And I know it's not growing because I'm not promoting it. And the biggest metric for me at the moment is no one unsubscribing. And it's better than I expected. Like, since I started writing daily, which is 25 days ago, I think, a few people have unsubscribed, of course, but not too many. Like, I'm still going stable. I've got a few new sign-ups. I've got a few unsubscribers. And then, of those daily emails, I once in a while put something on my website, on my personal website, like repurpose it as a blog post. Or I think about something that I wrote somewhere else and I put on my personal website. And you know what? I've not checked those stats in months since the start of the year. I almost never check the stats of my personal website because that's for me. Those are things that I wrote for myself. And if I wanted other people to read it, I've already shared it somewhere else because I know that people won't just come to my website to see what I have written.
So I have to ask this question. In the process of writing, and I mean this in the most specific sense, when you sit down at your keyboard to type, do you notice a difference in how it comes out of you when you're writing it for Coffee and Pens, like for me, the one who wants to write a book, versus when you're writing it for your newsletter and doing it just to write? Like, or is it the same until you go back to the edit process?
I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I know the writing itself is very different.
Okay.
So when I write for my newsletter, I start from one idea and I write from start to finish. And then I'll just, like, it's short. Usually it's short. I don't write long posts anymore. And then I'll read it again, check for typos, check if I can cut some words. And that's going to be it. Because I don't want to spend hours on something short.
Yeah.
That's going to be 200 words that I want to do daily. But when I write for Coffee and Pens, I go to different stages. I listen to the podcasts. I take notes per question. And then I look at those questions and I'm starting some kind of first edit. Like, what can I put together? Like, which part from the start of the podcast goes together with the end of the podcast? And I'm not going to mix it in the podcast. It's going to stay the same conversation. But when I write about it, I can put those things together because they make sense.
Yeah.
And I start joining the ideas and then I start writing them out. And then I go to an editing stage and then I start adding the links to like external websites and my own relevant links. And I go through like 3 or 4 stages for Coffee and Pens. And for personal writing, I go to like 1.5 stages maybe because I'm not even editing it seriously.
Do you prefer one over the other? Because it sounds like the newsletter writing is more...
It's casual.
I know you still edit it, but it's like stream of conscience, right? Like this is, I'm writing it and it's just coming out. Do you prefer one to the other? Like, is one more fun?
Stream of conscious writing is more fun, I guess, because it's, it's just you saying what you're thinking and not caring too much about what other people think.
Yeah.
It's got more personality. It's like, this is who I am, and I'm not going to put one word in because you like it, or I'm not going to delete this word because you'll dislike it. And with Coffee and Pens, it's a little bit more complicated. Like, I'm still going to try to be myself and add a little bit of personality in it. But in the end, it's not about me. It's about the people I interviewed. And so I've got to stay a little bit more like in the middle and like reach like a wider audience and not make it too much about myself, or like not trying to make it too funny or like too controversial or too opinionated.
So most writers read a lot.
Yeah.
How much are you reading?
I was not reading much books until I started Coffee and Pens. So I try to read one book per week, more or less, and that was not happening for the first months of the year. I read maybe 5 books until like before May. So that was one a month, more or less.
Yeah.
And then for Coffee and Pens, I interview authors and I try to read their book before the interview. And because I'm trying to do an interview per week, I've been trying to read a book per week. And so Coffee and Pens had a huge influence on the amount of reading I'm doing and what I'm learning from those books as well, because I get to apply what I read like in two ways. First, I'm taking notes, which I wasn't always doing before. Now I'm forcing myself to take notes because what I read is what I want to talk about, maybe. So I need the notes. If I don't take notes, I won't have conversation topics.
Sure.
And afterwards, I want to share the best notes from the book with my audience as well. Like, you know, if I've read the book, why not share what I've learned? And on the second level, I get to talk to the authors about their book. So I get to expand on those ideas of the book, or I get them to rephrase it to me like in different words, like in the interview live. So I think I'm learning a lot more from reading in this way through Coffee and Pens.
Were you a reader before? So I mean,
Yeah. Yes.
okay, because I was a reader in high school, let's say, and then in college, university, you get required reading, obviously. I think maybe through all of my 4 years, I read 3 books for pleasure.
Yeah.
And then a few years ago, like after I started the blog, I started to I want to read again.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of like it was with you. Like I want to read. I started at a book a month. And then, all of a sudden you read 14 in a year and you go, well, I was better than a book a month. I can do more than this. And I've never tried to set it to a book a week, but it has become that.
Yeah.
At a certain point, like it's like running. Like the more you do it, the faster you get. And now I'm a reader again. Aside from what you're reading for the podcast, do you read other things now?
A few. Yeah. So sometimes it happens that I read a very short book.
Okay.
Like from someone, or maybe I've read it before, and I do once a month. I do like what I call prolific writer special. I could ask you for the next one actually. So I talk to people that do a lot of writing. It doesn't matter in which form, but they have not published a book. So they could have written online courses. They could have written like many blog posts. They could, anything. And I ask them, what's your inspiration? What are your like top 3 writing tips? And what's your secret to being so prolific? That's something I do once a month. So I don't need to do any reading for that. And I don't need to do a lot of writing for that either, because it's a copy-paste job. So that allows me some time to read other stuff as well. So recently I've read Green Lights, Matthew McConaughey. It's kind of like autobiography. I liked
on my
it.
list.
We should not go into much detail about that. Like there were a few funny things in it, and I've used a few stories from that book in what I've written recently. But I feel he's like a little bit of like, oh, poor me, dude. You're a famous actor. You're rich, and we didn't want to go broke. But while I didn't want to do any more rom-coms, like, dude, how much money do you have? Like, you really don't want to go broke.
Yeah,
because you're not wanting to do more rom-coms, like really.
Yeah.
So that was a little bit of like a pain point, like a little bit of losing points there.
Yeah. Meanwhile, like you and I could do one of those movies and probably live comfortably for the rest of our lives, right? Like, so that's a biography. Do you reading any like fiction or?
No, not much. So what I am reading are a couple of parenting books. That's what I've been reading recently. So I'm now reading a parenting book. I've read maybe 2 in the last couple of months because I have my first daughter. She's 6 months old.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I don't want to do a terrible job, so I've been reading a little bit about it. What else am I reading? I tried to read Meditations from Marcus Aurelius because like many people recommend it.
Okay.
And I'm not sure, it's not me.
There is something about the quote unquote classics that do not hold up.
Yeah.
And I mean that in a conventional sense, right? Like, if you sit down and watch a movie, take any Marvel movie that's come out in the last 10 years. It's 2.5 hours, 2 hours and 15 minutes. Like, it's a long movie. And it's a departure from what existed in the 80s and 90s, where movies were 87 minutes, and by the 90th minute, you were out of the theater, right? Or you were already hitting rewind on the VHS. Like, those movies were formulaic, and they were 90 minutes. But if you go to the 70s and the 60s, those movies were 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
And the pacing is so different that a 2.5 hour movie made in 1970 and a 2.5 hour movie made now, they're just different forms of art, period, the end. And I feel like people are not as forgiving when it comes to the written word, that some of these classics don't hold up as well.
Yeah.
Like, and some of them I'm trying not to read. Like, I've been trying to get rid of stuff in my house. I was a pack rat for a very, very long time. And now the thing I have the most of in my house is books, which is never a bad problem to have, except that I don't think I've read all of these books. So I'm in the process of like trying to be like, I'm going to read the books in my house to see if I want to keep them.
Okay.
There are some books that are older that I'm just afraid to read.
Uh-huh.
Because I'm a completionist, so if I start it, I'm going to finish it. But I don't want to sludge through it if it's like, I don't know, like, is Catcher in the Rye really all I remember it to be? Like, it was something to me when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not that kid anymore. And, you know, it was written in a different time. And does it hold up? And so when you go back even further, like Marcus Aurelius, like, I don't know how much of that stuff holds up. And I don't know if we talk about that enough. And I'm going to get on my soapbox here for a moment.
Okay.
I feel like part of it is, hey, I read Shakespeare. The discussion is around how many fancy Renaissance or like famous authors I have read, not their work spoke to me. We don't talk about that part. We talk about like, oh, I read Shakespeare. Like, okay, good. But can you relate to it? Like, does it work for you? There's a Canadian author named Douglas Coupland. And I've been reading through his entire bibliography. He's actually not the only author who I'm reading through the entire bibliography for.
Okay.
But Douglas Coupland speaks to me on such a level that I am starting to try and comprehend now that I'm, I don't know, 7 books, 8 books into his, I don't know, he wrote like 20 books, so I have a lot more to go. He speaks to me. Is he Hemingway? You know, to me, he is, because he speaks to me in the way that my parents spoke about Hemingway.
Mm-hmm.
But Hemingway doesn't necessarily speak to me. Like, I'm not going back and reading, like, For Whom the Bell Tolls going, well, this is speaking to me. No, I didn't grow up in the Depression. Like, so I'm off my soapbox now, but like, it's not, you know, like, I don't think it's all equal. I think you find what you like and like hit it. And if you find somebody like Coupland for me, or like Len Dayton for me, where they've written 30 books, like, all the better. You have 30 books of theirs to read.
Yeah.
But to me, we don't hold books and authors in the same regard as everything else. Not everything's relevant all the time. Like, I know that. Like, my blog, I try and write things as evergreen as possible. For better or worse, that's a decision I have made.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean it's relevant.
Yeah.
It's 10 years. I've got 10 years of content on the internet. Look through the back catalog. There's stuff that's just completely crazy. Like, oh, that's not relevant anymore. Well, fine. But why can't the same be true for books? So, I mean, if you find something you like, I mean, pile it on, man. Like, that's
a good observation.
That's what I would say.
Like, I did a lot of reading classics. So I for a long time I had this maybe crazy idea that I did not want to buy Kindle books, because a book for me is something that you hold. Like, this is a notebook, but like reading goes like this. Like, you open the book and you go turn pages. It's not something.
Look, you're preaching to the choir, man. If I can, give me the book. I want to feel it in my hands.
But I reached a point living in, I've been living in South America, and well, for one, I once was sent a book from the United States. It was a gift, fortunately. It arrived almost 2 years later. So I'm not going to pay for a book that might never make it to my door.
Okay.
And if I'm going to order books anyway, I'm probably going to pay the same amount for shipping as I'm paying for the book, if not more.
Okay.
It's like no way I'm going to get books delivered to Bolivia or Peru. There aren't many English bookshops. I sometimes find like 1 or 2 English books that were definitely pirated. But no, that's out of the point. So for a long time, I didn't buy new books, or I bought books when I traveled to Belgium over the holidays. Bought a couple of books, packed them in my suitcase, but of course I can't bring 20 books because I need clothes and everything as well, you know. So they're like 5 to 10 books maybe. I'd go through those books and I'd be stuck without books for like 6 months, and I wouldn't buy Kindle books because, you know, I'm not paying for something that I can't hold.
Yeah.
And I did that for 2 or 3 years. And then one solution I found was, why don't I read free books? You know, you can read the classics on Kindle for free.
Yeah.
So I started reading the Russian novels, and they were long. So I got a lot of reading. But I'm also I'm not sure what the word is you said, completionist.
Yes.
So I start reading something and I feel like I need to finish it. And there are only 2 books that I started reading and I didn't finish. And I still got them around here somewhere. There are 2 Spanish books because I also speak Spanish. And I don't know, they just don't move forward. And I've still got them around, like hoping that one day I'll finish reading them, but I'm not sure if I will.
So how many languages can you read? Like, not speak, but how many languages can you read?
Oh, that's a fun question because I can read way more than I can speak. So my mother tongue is Dutch. It's actually like kind of like a dialect. So that's Dutch. I can read Dutch. I can read English and Spanish, and I can speak those languages pretty well. I can also read German because it's very similar to Dutch, but I can't speak it as well because the grammar is a lot more complicated. I had it in school, but you know, I forgot much.
Sure.
I can read French. I can speak a bit of French. And then many languages, like these are all Roman languages. So French, Italian, and Portuguese.
Yeah.
So I won't say that I can read fiction in Portuguese or Italian. But like, give me like the newspaper and I'll probably understand what it's about.
Do you enjoy reading in those other, like, I mean, I asked the question so I can set you up for like, you know, does it matter? Like if I gave you a choice, like here's a book, you're going to like it, but you can read it in any language you want. Like, do you have a like, would you, you know, what would you pick?
The original, if I can understand the original.
All right.
So I try to read, like there are good French authors, and I've read a few of those books in English, but you know, why not read it in French? You know, I understand French. I'll understand it better if I read in English. But you know, like if I have to read on Kindle anyway, I've got direct access to a dictionary.
Yeah.
So while I'm reading and I don't understand this word, and this means that I don't understand the sentence, well, I'll look it up. So I've read, I think it was Gustave Flaubert, or maybe also Victor Hugo. Like I read one French book at the start of the year, and I've got a Portuguese book in the list as well that I want to read. I'm not sure how it will go, but I want to give it a try.
Do you notice any differences in writing style from language to language to language? Because obviously, I mean, we started off like a while ago talking about cultural colloquialisms and stuff. So obviously, the writing's going to be slightly different. Do you notice that?
I don't think I'm in a good place to reply because like those books that I've read in other languages are books from the past.
Okay.
You know, when did Victor Hugo live? I'm not even sure, but I think it's almost a century ago, you know.
Okay.
And I read, they're not there's not a very big Dutch like set of good old like classic books. So there aren't that many. Like the public's not, the audience is not as big, so the number of writers isn't as big as well. And I've not read too many to like give a good comparison.
I mean, do most authors want to do it in English anyway? Like, I'm presuming the audience is slightly bigger if you write in English. I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think so. So, um, I don't know. Like, I would write a book in English.
Okay.
I'm not sure why, but I feel that I do all my writing in English. I'm not even sure if I've ever written and published something in Dutch. It's my mother tongue. Like, apart from everything they pay me to write, like most of my paid work is in Dutch. But what I write for myself or Coffee and Pens is usually in English.
I wonder if, I mean, I wonder just as an experiment, like if you wrote a post in Dutch,
Yeah.
like see what would happen.
I don't have an audience.
You don't know actually. How do you know?
Yeah, I might do. But where do I find them? Because the people that follow me on Twitter, for example, well, they're not. I've talked to 3 people that know Dutch.
Okay.
I've got some kind of connection with them, but there's 3 people out of just under 2,000. So I don't know.
That's fair. I
like I could put it on Facebook, but Facebook's a different place.
Yeah. No, all right. I guess I want to get back to you writing this book for a moment. Do you have it in your head, like not bucket list, but like I want to write it? Are you actively looking for that topic now? Are you like, do you have like, by the time I'm 50, I want to have this book published? Like, do you have those goals set for yourself, or is it just kind of like when it happens, it happens?
I've got a vague idea about everything here. So, where to start? I know I actually have one idea. I've got one book that's like waiting to be written. But now is not a good time.
Okay.
Let me tell you why. The book I want to write is how do you start like writing a book? Like how do you self-publish your first non-fiction book? That's kind of like the book I want to write.
Okay.
Now what's the problem? I've never written a book. No one's going to buy a book about how to write a book from someone who has never written a book. Am I right?
I mean, it's fair. Yeah.
So I feel like with all these interviews that I've been doing, I'm in the right place to start writing this book. But it can't be the first book I'm writing. And on top of that, if I write another book first and I'm documenting the entire process of writing that book, then the other book is going to have like an added layer, and it's going to be worth so much more because it's going to have personal stories in there as well.
100%. Yeah.
So I've got this idea, and when is it going to happen? I don't know. Maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, but hopefully not longer. But what I need is that first book. And that's something I've been working on. In a conversation like this one, so I was on my first podcast on Saturday. So this is the second time I'm doing this like a long form podcasting thing in which I talk about coffee and pens. And I think it came from that conversation. Like, why don't you kind of publish a compilation of like the first 50 interviews that you do, something like that?
Sure.
So I thought, Tim Ferriss has these 2 books, Tribe of Menders and Duel of Titans. I've heard about the books, I've seen parts of it, but I've never read them. I just bought them yesterday, so they'll arrive in Belgium, and hopefully I will go to Belgium next month, so I'll be able to read them. And so I'm thinking, okay, so when I hit 50 interviews, and there are going to be 50 interviews with people that talk about the same topic, which is writing books, can I compile all those interviews in a book like Tribe of Mentors, like Tribe of Orders,
and
to give it like a title right now?
Off the top of my head, because it's a book I've read, Mark Maron did the same thing, right? Waiting for the Punch is just excerpts from the podcast in different sections. It's something similar. So yeah, I mean that it exists and it's out there, and I mean I almost want to ask you, like, why don't you write your story? because we all have a story. I mean, one of the things that I feel like, because people who, and you probably get this a little bit, but you have a niche. I'm just talking to anybody, but I get like, well, who are you talking to? And I'll say Joe Smith, and they'll go, why? I'm like, because he's got a story like that, period, the end. So we all have that. So, I mean, if you wanted to, like your autobiography up to a point, right? It's there as another story you can tell.
Yeah. It's funny you bring this up, and I'm not sure if we talked about this before, if I'm just getting things mixed up in my head, because I was writing about this just before the interview. So someone said, why don't you write, like, I saw he has a now page. What's a now page? Instead of like about page or projects or anything, it's just, this is what I'm working on right now.
Okay.
So I saw that and I was like, hey, this is fun. I should write a now page. So I wrote a now page. And one of the things I put on that now page is that I'm kind of writing an autobiography, but I'm not sure if it's the right thing. So let's go back again about a month and a half maybe. And I think I may have mentioned this. I've got this idea of, why don't I write a thread about what's been happening in my life for the past 5 months, how I got from doing a gap year from volunteering to where I am right now, like how I started writing. So why don't I do that? And I got some positive feedback. Oh, like, cool story. Like, I'd love to learn more about like this or that. So I took that idea, I put it on my website, and I added a few photos and like a little bit more details. And, you know, a few people read it and it's like, oh, this is cool, this is inspiring. And then I talked with my friend Mike on Friday. We always have a chat on Friday. We always call each other on Fridays and talk. I've met him on Twitter. Like, we've never met in real life, but we've got like a cool connection going on. And he said, why don't you like turn that into some kind of autobiography? Like, you could write it for your daughter.
Yeah.
So I've kind of been working on that. Just like, it's what I have is now maybe 4,000 words, probably a bit less, and it's spanning about 5 years. And I just have this idea, like, why not every Saturday, if I'm feeling ready for it and if I have time, just read it again and add a couple of details. Like, not part by part, but just like try to read everything and add a few details along the way. So I'm always expanding on the story, but like from the top, like not from section by section. So that's something I've been working on like slowly, and I'm not sure if I'll ever publish it. I don't think at this moment of time there is a big enough audience for people to read my story, but who knows?
I don't think that I can state enough that you don't mess with a streak, because whether it's a winning streak, a hitting streak, or a writing streak, Crash Davis and Bull Durham says it best. A player on a streak has to respect the streak. And for me, that goes for flow too. If I'm in it, if I'm feeling it, I have to see what fruit it will bear before it ends, because you don't know when the next one will be coming. But you can still be creative without being on a creative hot streak, because as Kjell said, there are different kinds of writing. And my suggestion to you is that if you are in a rut writing for someone else, if it's your job or, any other reason, then take a break and write for yourself. Writing is like any other skill. The more you do it, the better you get. And it doesn't matter who you're writing for when you're in the process of writing for exercise. And unfortunately for me, at least, the writing that happens in my head is really good. And I need to get better at stopping what I'm doing and writing it down so I don't lose it. It's not hyperbole that I've lost more good ideas than I've ever published, at least in the past. The goal is to tip the scales moving forward. So, 2 questions to leave you with. 1, are you writing down all of the inspiration from the writing in your head? And have you taken the time to identify who it is you are writing for, or even creating content for? If you can work towards affirming the answers to both of those questions, you may find yourself swimming in content with a larger audience. Let me know how it goes. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, episode 55. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes. And now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can tweet me at Agent Palmer, my guest Kjell at Kjell VDV, that's KJELLVDV, and this show at the Palmer Files. For all things Kjell, you can visit coffeeandpens.com or KjellV.com, that's KJELLV. And on those sites, you can find links to his podcast, newsletter, and read what he's writing. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. Do you have one final question for me?
I'll just pop the same question I ask at the end of every interview I do. Maybe it's going to be a bit more difficult because, this has been reversed.
That's fine. That's fine.
But thinking about everything we talked about, everything related to writing and having a blog and doing the podcast and everything, what is your secret?
I don't know if I have one other than I'm a happier person when I'm creating. I won't say I'm not, look, I've been out of work for almost 2 years now, and depression is kind of exists because you feel like no one's ever going to hire you.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
I have these creative outlets and I'm always creating. And I go back to when I was fully employed. And for the 8 of the 10 years of the blog, I had a full-time job.
Yeah.
And I would come home and I would write, or I would come home and I would edit, or I would come home and I would watch a movie and take notes, or read a book, or this, that, and the other thing. And then I got into podcasting and I would come home and I would either write or start recording, or,
mm-hmm.
Creating to me, it's not secret, but it's the thing that keeps me going. I enjoy hitting publish,
yeah,
and then moving on to the next thing, because there's always a next thing if you're always creating. And I don't know if it's a secret, but it's definitely my motivation. Like,
yeah,
it keeps me sane. It doesn't matter. Actually, I feel like it might actually. You can tell when I'm depressed or having a rough time because I will double down on work. So I went through a breakup a few years ago and had more blog post output like in order to get through it, just to be like, I just have to be doing something. Let me create something. And so for me, it's just always be creating. That's really it. Yeah. I go through some writer's block and I have some issues and it's like, I don't feel like editing today, but I always want to be creating something. And for me, that's kind of where it ends. Like, or it doesn't end. That's why it never ends, is because I always want to be creating something.
Yeah. I think that's a problem of being a prolific creator. You can't stop. And when you do stop, that's what I experience. Something's missing. Like when I'm not writing something and publishing something, something's missing. Like something's not right. Yeah. I don't feel fulfilled.
Yeah, that's the key word right there. Fulfilled. Like I feel like, you know what? I'm not going to get into the whole like every day's a gift thing. That's depending. That's an outlook. That's a philosophy. But for me, If I accomplished something in a day, I wrote a blog post, I edited a blog post, I recorded an episode, I edited an episode, I wrote an intro. If I did something, created something out of nothing, basically, then I did something that day and I accomplished something that day. And then that day was good.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what else happened. I did something.
Mm-hmm. It's addictive, you know. You start it and you can't stop. And sometimes I wonder, or I ask myself, why did I even start creating? Like, I could be perfectly happy consuming all the time, but not anymore, because I got to know what it feels like to start writing and sharing it. And I look around at people and they're on their phones, they're just like this the entire day.
Yeah.
Like, how do you do it? How can you wake up in the morning, stare at your phone, maybe go to work for a while or attend your classes for a while, get back home, stare at your phone again, not create anything and still feel fulfilled? I don't understand. I maybe was the same when I was younger, but now I don't know anymore how that happens.
Many episodes ago at this point, I had a guest on, and Rebecca is an audio engineer, and we talked about the world in terms of inputs and outputs. We're always inputting stuff. We're always consuming. But what are you putting out, right? And optimistically, and in probably some made-up world, we're 50-50. We're consuming as much as we're putting out. But we're only one person. And it's hard to do that. So I think, because I've had a lot of time to think since that episode, maybe you're looking at 3-1. Like, if I consume 3 things, I want to put at least one thing back into the world. And for better or worse, I may or may not hit that ratio on a given week, but I try because I want to put more out there. And so, it's, what are you putting out there? And we're both doing that, or we're trying to.
Yeah, I think it's more in terms of the time spent than the amount of like the number, because like looking at the number, I consume a lot more than what I write, because I'm subscribed to 20 plus newsletters and I read all of them on Sunday, and then I open the best links and I read all of that probably on Monday or Tuesday. So, but that's 20 newsletters I'm reading. That's probably 20 articles or blog posts that I'm reading then. So those are 40 pieces of content. I'm not going to put out then 13 pieces of content myself.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, of those 40 things that I read, maybe only 5 or 6 were worthwhile.
Yeah.
But the problem is it's not always the same that are worthwhile. It's not that week 1, I get something from newsletter A, and week 2, week newsletter A again. That's not how it works.
And you don't know until you click the link, and you don't know until you read the article. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's more about time spent.
I like it.